Welcome to the Dean's Research Seminar for November. And today I'm delighted that we've got Bill Malcolm, who's going to talk about his work. Professor Malcolm, Bill, has been part of a long tradition of agricultural economics in this faculty. He joined University of Melbourne School of Agriculture and Forestry in 1980 as a tutor in the agricultural economics section, led by Professor Alan Lloyd. Bill's passionate about farming, agriculture and economics, and he has a strong commitment to teaching, research and engagement in the university, in Australia and indeed internationally. In 2004, he was president of the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society. In 2014, he became a distinguished fellow of the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society. From 2009 to 2019, when he was Associate Professor of Agricultural Economics here at the University of Melbourne, he was also Principal Scientist in Farm Systems Economics at the Victorian Department of Primary Industries, and in effect had a dual appointment between Agriculture Victoria and the University of Melbourne. Bill's now a full professor in the University of Melbourne in the School of Agriculture and Food. He's authored and co-authored 9 books, 3 of which are used as tertiary textbooks in Australia and indeed internationally. He's written 13 book chapters, 120 academic journal articles, 200 conference papers and 70 reports, and has supervised over 75 postgraduate students, many of whom have gone on to senior roles in the public service, the private sector and academia. He's very well regarded as an agricultural economist. Bill, over to you.
Productivity, productivity, productivity. More of it is a good thing. I'll show you some slides in a second, but I'll just give you a little bit of background. I was recruited by Alan Lloyd in 1980, as John said, and Alan did some of the first work on the returns to research, and work later picked up by Julian Olson and Phil Pardy and John Mullen. And when Alan first had a look, it was ag research was a good investment then, and as it is now. It's Alan concluded at that time in the early 80s that farmers could actually pay a bit more levy and they'd still be better off. And he used to go around to meetings and tell farmers this, and it wasn't all that well received. And Alan told me about some godforsaken place in East Gippsland in a mechanics hall one evening, and him and the chairman nearly outnumbered the audience, and the chairman got stuck into the audience blaming those who had come for those who hadn't. And the chair finished up by saying, if more of you buggers would turn up, we'd get ourselves a decent speaker. So that was Alan Lloyd, a great researcher, a great leader. And he said to my instructions for teaching ag science, Alan used to regard it as, or used to quote it as being an activity where he was casting artificial pearls before genuine swine. But he was very fond of his students. He had some terrific students back in that day. And one message he left me with was, ensure your students don't leave through the same door that they come in. And that's been the sort of philosophy of teaching ag science at the University of Melbourne, I guess. Let me share a screen here and show some slides. I've told you about Alan Lloyd doing early research and productivity being the name of the game. What I wanted to talk about, first of all, it's a general talk for a general audience. Every slide could be a whole lecture. But this bit more than last year, I had to show you this. Here's a budget from a Mallee farm. A couple of boys went farming in the Mallee in 1925. And here's their budget. And we've got all the expenses there. We're buying bags of oats, and the blacksmith was 15 quid and the saddler was £5, and all the expenses there. And we've got living expenses, a bit more than last year. And it might reflect a bit of hope over experience, but it was a rough shed in the Mallee in the 1920s, and farming was a hard life. But that farm is still going nearly 100 years later, and the history of that farm in a way reflects a lot of the changes that occurred in productivity in Australian agriculture over the years. And I remember talking to these farmers, and about the big changes, and they had a tractor in 1930 when it had rubber tyres that made tractors work in the sand, whereas before that tractors weren't much good. And they said 1930 we got a tractor and a wireless. And then bulk handling came in the 50s. During the Second World War, barley was £3 a pound, and they bought a neighbouring farm for £3 an acre. Lay farming in the 50s come in. The changes kept coming. The mid-70s, minimum tillage came in. And so there was a history of productivity change, slow and steady, very risky environment. But I asked them about the difference the tractor made, and they said, well, looked at me like it was a stupid question and said, well, first of all, it meant we didn't have to keep a third of the crop to feed the horses. And I thought, oh, that's a bit of a productivity change. And I asked them about the wireless, and they said, oh, you had the wireless. Well, we got that just before 1930. That was partly to listen to Bradman batting in England at the time. We had the Country Hour on the ABC, and then we had Old Sam. Old Sam Wadham, 11:30 every second Sunday with his radio for farmers, his talks for farmers on the radio. And that was sort of there's a history of innovation there. But let me mention now Old Sam, because Sam Wadham, the focus he had reflects what I want to talk about today. 1925 again, a couple of professors from Melbourne Uni went to England and went to Cambridge and met a young Sam Wadham and talked him into applying for a job in Melbourne to be Professor of Agriculture. The committee in Melbourne, though, of learned professors who knew as much about farming as a pig knows about a holiday, they knocked Sam back, because Sam had been candid enough to admit that, well, no, he couldn't really drive a plough and he wasn't sure he could manage a team of horses. And the university professor said, no, well, that's no good to us. We want practical men for agriculture. And that was it, practical men. And that's what they wanted. And luckily that decision was overturned. And I suppose it's good, John, our dean, that we don't apply the same exacting standards nowadays either. But so Sam got the job. For the next 30 years, he dominated the University of Melbourne agriculture and wider university, but let me stay on agriculture. He met with farmers, he worked with farmers, he learned about farming in Australia and Victoria, and his focus was on productivity, technological change, good ag science research. It was one, and in doing that, he surrounded himself with really good people, really good recruitment, Geoffrey Leaper, Yvonne Aitken. He supervised the masters of Bruce Davidson. Big focus on increasing ag productivity via technology. And he also introduced economics. He said, well, economics of agricultural practice, badly represented in Cambridge, but I propose to emphasise in Melbourne. And he once said, I'm not an agricultural economist. He said, I'm far too interested in the agriculture to be called an agricultural economist. But he actually got the economics right. And that's where his second big contribution to ag productivity was encouraging structural adjustment. And he saw through the folly of the closest settlement ideas that had dominated land settlement in Australia, and the effects of which overhang to this day. So Sam saw two pathways to increasing agricultural productivity. Structural adjustment so farms could be an efficient size, recognising that new technology often came with size. And the other one was ag R&D, as I mentioned. So that was Professor Wadham. And those two ideas are still valid today. Let me move on to productivity, because we've all got some idea of productivity. It's a ratio. We know that. It's some ratio of output to input. We measure it as dollar value of output over dollar value of input, with the idea is, we're getting more from the same, or we're getting the same from less, or we're getting a bit more from a little bit more, or less from even lesser. And it can be estimated as an annual ratio for a single farm, or more usually as abetted does it. It's an index for the whole industry, the sectors, where you, over time, you collect data, you value the inputs, you value the outputs, express it as a ratio, And that graph there in the bottom corner of that slide shows you we've got an index of inputs, we've got an index of outputs, and the change of them is an index of productivity change. And the point that is concerning is the annual growth in productivity across sectors, that's broadacre there, is not what it used to be. We were getting 2% growth in the 70s, 80s, 90s. We're struggling to get 1% now. Over the whole period, broadacre has averaged 1% growth in productivity, which has come from a 0.9% reduction in inputs and a pretty flat output. We talk about total factor productivity or multi-factor productivity. It's not total factor in that we don't count some of the inputs there. Capital's tricky to value, and we usually don't count management. And on the output side, the quality issue is always a bit difficult to handle too. But the story so far is then the rate of productivity gains in agriculture is slowing. This is worldwide. This comes from work from Julian Olson and Phil Pardey and heaps of others. Worldwide, it's slowing. The growth is slowing. But also the public investment is slowing. Luckily, private investment is picking up in lots of parts of the world. But the arguments made here is there's good returns to ag investment in ag RD&E. It's a classic market failure. There's a role of government. The public should be in there. It's still one of the best investments the public can make. It can be done better. The ag R&D can be done better. The investment decisions can be made better with more benefit cost analysis of identifying the better investments. And the RD&E can be done more efficiently by getting those, what I call research overheads down, and I'll explain that in a minute. The second part of the argument made here is that opportunity cost matters, and poor policy imposes opportunity costs on productivity, on other farmers by restricting the adjustment, the natural or normal rate of adjustment, which would happen without the poor policy that is hindering it. So nowadays, proper policy analysis seems to be a thing of the past. Benefit cost analysis seems to be a thing of the past. The modern way is the grants economy. You know, dear taxpayer, send money. Dear voter, how much would you like? And I'm saying if we did that better, we can lift productivity of agriculture. There's a couple of themes I want to touch on here. First, productivity gains increases our choices in agriculture, but as we increase our farm production, our farm size, our farm choices, it increases the complexity and the volatility of farming. That's fine. You just got to be good to manage the increased complexity and increased volatility, and not all farmers are equipped to do that. The second theme is that in research and development, there is an inevitable tension between abstraction and reality. And we know we've got to abstract from reality to do science, we've got to abstract from reality to do economics. That's fine. It's that the linkage, if that linkage gets tenuous, and this is a point that John Paciura has been making for some time about this, the link between abstraction and reality, the link between the laboratory experiment and the farm or paddock performance. And John Paciura's my favourite agricultural scientist, or the person I regard highest in Australia in agricultural science, I guess. But there's a parallel with that with all of our work. Here's another photo here. I'll just show you the link between reality and our abstract models. There's Peter Doyle, another highly esteemed, one of the best animal nutritionists you'd ever meet, but an old-style agriculturalist who understood the full system, the whole system. And we used to do a lot of modelling together with really good students of farm systems and farm supply, feed supply and farm feed demand for dairy cows. And the sort of thing on the left there is the sort of model we'd have. That's an abstraction from the paddock. And so I remember talking about this, and so we got together, well, how much can a cow actually eat in a day? How many bites can she take? A medium-sized cow, how many bites? And how much milk can she make and maintain herself in a year? And so that's it. That's what she needs each day for the year, and medium size, she'll make 5,000 litres. If we wanted to make more than that, we're going to have to introduce more feed of supplements. So that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about this link between abstraction and reality. Just a bit of background. Most of you, I know agriculture in Australia as well as I do, but for those that don't, I asked the students, how big is agriculture in Australia? What percentage of the GDP? And they'll say 80%, 60%. And most people don't realise it's 2% of the GDP, it's 3% of employment. But the farmers manage 70% of Australia's land at least and use 70% of Australia's water. The output is more volatile than pretty much most agriculture in nearly every other country. Agriculture is more volatile than any other economic activity in Australia. And we're price takers. We just got to make our product and say who bids, how much do you offer. It's less subsidised, less supported than any other activities. It's high risk, as I said, and they're on a cost price squeeze where the costs go down and the prices costs go up and the prices go down, and you've got to increase productivity. That's the productivity imperative. You've got to run faster to keep up. Just to show you, people don't realise the extent to which these prices go down. There's a great graph here on the right from Andrew. Wheat price from England from 1200 to the present. Demand exceeded supply up until 1800. The Industrial Revolution, supply exceeded demand, prices come down. From 1900, food, non-food. That's the situation of Australian farmers, and their costs are going up at the same time as the rest of the economy competes for resources. You must run faster to keep up. That's the imperative for productivity gain. Okay, but good farmers do it. They can do well. There's a return on capital as good as anything in the economy. Good farmers can do that. Most don't. Risk creates return. Increasing risk makes increasing return. You can have a very low risk life. You'll have a low return life. It's the risk that makes farming worth doing in Australia, but it also makes it hard, and you've got to be really good at it. And if you do, it's as good an investment as there is in the economy. Here's a graph that shows you, I call it the hangover from the closer settlement schemes that Sam Wadham was trying to correct. 2080, 1050, 20% of farmers make 80% of the output. 10% make 50%. Highly skewed, a small number of farmers make most of the output, and yet, as Mike Stevens says, 20% make all the value, 80% make all the noise. So the political decisions are skewed, adjustment is hindered, productivity is less than it would otherwise be. That's the argument I'm running. Australian farmers who export are world class. It's one of the few Australia's export world class industries, but we measure it as percentage subsidy as a percentage of income, and it's small, right? So it's there, we mark there compared to most countries, Europe, America, USA, whatever, very small. But the real cost is the resource misallocation cost that is occurring because of like drought subsidies we give, for instance, which hinders the natural rate of adjustment. The US there, you can see, is subsidise a fair proportion of income there. Nick Piggott, a mate of mine, works in North Carolina, works with farmers, and he says one of his farmers gets a cheque in the mail, $100,000 a year. And Nick said, he said to the farmer one year, "What are you going to plant this year?" And the farmer said, "Oh, I think I might plant one more of those mailboxes." We're not at that level, but the cost of the misallocation cost of the assistance we do give is limiting our productivity growth. Let me talk a bit more about productivity. What is it? This is the idea that's in scientists' heads and economists' heads. The idea of a production function, the idea of adding more inputs to get more output, but diminishing marginal responses. If it was a straight line, you'd feed the world out of a bucket, just to keep pouring in fertiliser and seed and away you go. It's not. That's the basic idea. There's three forms of efficiency shown there. There's technical efficiency, which scientists all over the world often think anyway, is the aim. That's maximising production for the inputs. And that's, this point here, maximum production. Economists, there's farm efficiency, which is sort of where I work, which is no, it's back a bit because the last unit of production is never worth making. I can't get this through my colleagues' heads sometimes, but maximum production is not the name of the game. Profitable production is, and that's less than maximum production, particularly once you take account of risk. Okay, and then there's the sort of economy-wide efficiency of using resources efficiently, where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. And that's where adjustment of resources out of poorly performing farms into the hands of better performing farmers is one of the sources of productivity gain. There's another related idea of a frontier, a technical frontier, similar thinking, but you can get data from farms. Chris O'Donnell does this best in the world at it. You can plot where farms sit according to some sort of theoretical, achievable, technical efficiency frontier. And at any time, there's farms right up here near this frontier doing a terrific job. There's this long tail of farms down here, and there always has been. Now, it's a free country. You can farm as badly as you like, provided you're not getting subsidised and paid by the public to do it. Policies to prop up Farmer N, is really saying, oh, we're not very good at this, but let's do more of it. When in the hands of farmers G and B, we could big productivity gains potential. That's within the given technology. So there's two sources of productivity gain, I see it. One is reorganising within known technology, reorganising resource use, and size comes into this, and size and technology adoption. And some technologies are scale neutral, some really suit size, and some modern ones may even suit smaller sizes like robotics and stuff. But size and technology are clearly closely related. Size and adoption of technology are closely related. So that's reorganisation here. That's the structural adjustment argument. Here's the good science, new technology, returns to RD&E, bringing in technological change. Parallel to this type of thinking is the idea of yield gap, which Tony Fisher has written a book on and done a lot of work on, and just gave a paper to the Advanced Society of Agronomy in the US. And I see this yield gap idea really misused naively often by scientists who don't understand the farm system. And Tony, obviously, he's all over it. The reality is there's a potential yield given unconstrained inputs, and then there's a real yield at farm level. And to use Tony's words, yield is complex. And there's many things that determine the actual yield you can get on a farm. And so this yield gap, with new technologies and that, we can keep squeezing it up, but there's always going to be this gap because that's how reality works. Again, this link between reality and abstractions. I guess the related point I wanted to make there was 1968, Bruce Davison, the great Australian ag economist, had a paper in Nature where Bruce looked at experimental yields and yields achieved in paddocks, and he ended up saying there's a relationship, a factor of about 0.6 between what you can do from a paddock and what experimental will do. And I've been sort of using that roughly forever in evaluating research proposals and things like that. That's the yield gap idea. Productivity. Is ag R&D a good investment? What's more of it worth? Who gets it? Yes, it's a good investment. It's worth a lot. The benefits are shared between farmers and consumers. If you look at lots of research projects that have been done, and again, Julian Olsen and Phil Carty have done this, average types of returns, 10 to 20% return on capital. Think of that in the light of long-term risk rates of return across 100 years, across most of the economies in the world, is 6 to 8%. 3 to 4% risk-free, 6 to 8% allowing for risk. So investments in ag R&D&E give you 10 to 20%. It's better than most investments in the economy. And the conclusion the economists draw from that is we are not doing enough of it. Because if you're doing, we should be doing more of it, because of equally marginal returns, the returns will drop off as you do more of it. So there's plenty of scope to do a lot more ag R&D&E on that evidence. What's it worth? 1% increase in productivity in the grains industry is worth 60 million a year. 1% increase in dairy is worth 40 million a year, 1% increase in productivity in land production worth 20 million a year. These are the sorts of numbers we get out of the equilibrium displacement modelling that Gary Griffith and Ross Kingwell does. So the real dollar, it's real. There's real benefits to be had. Who gets it? This throws people a bit. About 30 to 50% of the benefit goes to farmers, 40 to 50 goes to consumers, and in between gets a little bit. So it's shared. These benefits are shared. Another reason why there's a good case for public investment in ag, R.D&E. The performance of productivity, Dr. David Smith, 1984, the late Dr. Smith was a senior lecturer in agronomy at the School of Ag. David became the Director General of the Department of Agriculture, and in the lower theatre in the old ag building, David gave a presentation, and I remember clearly David said, in the next 10 years, agriculture in Victoria will increase its productivity by 25%. And Alan Lloyd gently chided David, saying, David, that's like saying the next Pope is going to be a Roman Catholic. Because those are the numbers we were used to. 70s and 80s, 2.5% increase in productivity, best performing sector of the economy. Those are the numbers we were used to. And how do these productivity gains, where do they come from? There's an adoption story here. There's a famous graph here, it keeps getting added to it, needs updating again, but yields in cropping in Australia, we started with getting a tonne from virgin country. We quickly mined it down to half a tonne to the hectare by 1900. Then we got rust-resistant wheats, we got superphosphate, and we learnt to fallow to conserve moisture and provide disease breaks. 1930s, that's when tractors moved in the Mallee. We had legume pastures in the late cropping phases of the 50s, better rotations, more mechanisation. We had bulk handling in the 50s. Come up to 1970s, Tim Reeves, we've got semi-dwarf cultivars, we've got green revolution stuff, we've got selective grass herbicides, fantastic, up to a point till the ryegrass developed resistance, but that's an ongoing battle. Canola became a great crop to grow, a great crop, a valuable oilseed crop, bagged nitrogen fertiliser. Then we're up into the digital age in the 90s. We suddenly got GPS steering, which got adopted very quickly because it worked. New ideas every day, really. Subsoil manuring that Peter Sale's doing and Roger Armstrong, it's showing enormous promise in medium and high rainfall. We've got crops you can grain and graze. We've got dry seeding back in the Mallee, which we were never going to do. And so the point I wanted to make is adoption takes time. Look at this, for instance. There's our no-till cropping. 1970s, when I was at uni, that idea started, and we remember watching the neighbours thinking, oh, it won't work in a dry year. But after the big drought of 82, it sort of took off. But it took 25 years to get 50% of our grain crops grown with minimum till. It's now up near over 90%, varying paddock by paddock, year by year, obviously. But the point is, hybrid corns took about 30 years. GE corn took about 13 years. So there's a fair lag time in any of these new technologies I'm talking. The actual performance, there it is. There's our 2% for the 70s, 80s, 90s. Fell apart in mid-90s to the Federation out there, early 2000s. Some good performance in 2005 to 2010. Big year in 2010-11, wet years, and fell apart the last few years with big drought. But we take drought out of it. This is the point. You can plot productivity like that from ABARE, and you'll find it follows rainfall. So ABARE is very good at analysing this data. So take the rainfall out and take the climate out, and we'll get a climate-adjusted total factor productivity, which is the red line. And I think that sustains the argument of good growth, 70s to 90s, flatline through the 90s to early 2000s, picked up a bit since then. and that's 2015. But the point about interpreting this type of productivity data is it only has long-run meaning. Any particular year is meaningless. In fact, in any year, if the price is right, productivity can go down, but profit will go up. So it tells you nothing about profit in any specific way. 2016, we had a wet year, high prices, and farmers were planting the sheep yards. So the more marginal paddocks get brought into action, productivity drops, but profit goes up. So it's a mistake to try and look at that sort of data and think it tells us anything about profitability of individual farms or the merit of any particular RD&E. It tells us about general trends in a sector, in an economy. And there's the dairy job. The dairy industry's terrible performance since about 2000 at least. Here's a good use of the productivity data. It tells us something about our comparative advantage and competitiveness with other countries. And, we're tracking along there steadily, similar to the USA and Canada. That's just be careful with interpreting this sort of data. In fact, if you want to understand about performance of farms in a sector, we really need to look at return on capital. Are we building equity, growth in equity? Are we liquid? Can we pay our bills? Can we service our debt? So, and part of this talk, I'd say, is these productivity measures have a role, and the AB's got all the data, and I'd be making more use of distributions of performance of farm businesses according to return on capital, according to building wealth, and according to liquidity. Remembering that the objective is to build wealth, because wealth creates choices for farmers to fulfil their goals. So I'd be making more of those other measures as well, especially the distribution, to show the tale of pretty poorly performing farms that may not be going a long way to achieving farmers' goals. Let's go the other way. Let's go this way. So I've reached the stage of the talk where I've got about another maybe 10 minutes. As I please, as George Orwell titled his regular column in the Tribune, 1943 to 1947. And here I want to talk about a few things. The much reviewed RDC system, an Australian innovation, looked at with envy in many parts of the world. The levy system, 50% matching funds from the public. Farmers contribute to the research in proportion to the benefits they get. Public contributes to the research in proportion to the benefits they get. It's an alternative system to a tax-based system, which is the other way you can fund public research. And the tax-based system is used a lot more in the US and in Europe, but that's an alternative. There is an alternative. Is this system stable? Is it secure? You look up, there's a dozen recent over the last dozen years, there seems to be a dozen reviews of the RDCs, and I won't go through that now, but there's different criticisms. There was a stronger emphasis on science and economics, I think, in the earlier years than later. Growth of sort of marketing type emphases, which aren't as useful. Some farmers are strong supporters, some are very critical. There's one farmer, a big critic of one of you, I won't say the RDC, but one RDC cops a lot of flack, and one farmer's a big critic. And I told him about what the soldiers in France, the British soldiers in France in the First World War used to talk about how their leadership and their generals and the soldiers would say they were lions led by donkeys. And my farmer mate adopted this and used it to describe his RDC and was threatened with legal action. So you just got to be careful what you say. The system, the levy system, again, to go back to Julian Olson, he says it has some issues in that there's a generational issue. If I'm near the end of my farming career, the levies I'm paying, going to benefit someone 20 or 30 years out. It's not going to benefit me. There's a problem there. There's a problem with the Productivity Commission, for instance, in 2010 suggested that, no, the public should only do research on externalities on beyond the farm gate. And Julian and I went down to the Productivity Commission to try and make this case that there's genuine market failure. It's got a good benefit cost ratio. If there's a genuine market failure and we can fix it with a good benefit cost ratio, we should do it. And then if we can get the beneficiary to pay, all the better. That the levy system is not inevitable. So it's going to be looked at a lot and closely. And I think its continuation will depend a fair bit on delivering the goods. And that's more than just getting marketing people working for RDCs going out trying to convince farmers they're doing a good job. Much better would be to have a stream of new technologies coming on stream for farmers to adopt and to have a heap of PR saying we're doing a good job. There are some rules of public investment. These no longer seem to apply so rigidly as they should, I think. First of all, is there a market failure? Secondly, is the research proposed a good fit with the strategy of the organisation? Is it the right organisation to be doing that research? Is the science good? Do the benefits exceed the costs? They're the rules, and return to those rules would be good. Hard questions for scientists, which I always ask when I'm in this evaluating research. I think better research evaluation would lead to better research investments, and I think that's a weakness at the moment. People seem to just know we don't need benefit cost analysis, we don't need research. We just know that genetics is the answer, and so that's a criticism I've been making in public quite a bit. I think we need better evaluation and looking at ask the scientists, what's the productivity from the problem you're solving? Are you solving problems that people are asking, or are we solving problems that no one's asking? What effect will the innovation have at the whole farm level? What's the likelihood it'll be achieved? And we need to put together a plausible story. Coming back to opportunity cost and productivity, is structural adjustment being helped or hindered? And that's the question. And here's a graph that sort of answers that question. We had deregulation, widespread microeconomic reform in the mid-80s. That graph shows you from 1950 to 2019. The value of agricultural production is plotted on the vertical axis, right? Red up to mid-80s, blue up to post-80s. It coincides with microeconomic reform. It coincides with us getting rid of numerous, from 1940s to 1980s, really, we had marketing boards for everything. Every state had a milk marketing board, egg marketing board. Victoria once had an onion marketing board. Go back further, Queensland had state butcher shops. There was a lot of regulation of agriculture, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and we finally started to get rid of it. When I say we, ag economists have been making the arguments to get rid of dairy regulation, which basically taxed consumers and ran a two-price scheme, kept a high price for milk domestically and shoveled milk off overseas at a lower price and taxed consumers without them knowing it. We had quotas on eggs, all sorts of rackets to restrict the supply, force the price up to consumers to give farmers a higher income. The result of all that sort of mess is distortion of resource use, inefficient industries, disadvantaging the more efficient industries disadvantaged. We've got rid of a lot of that, and that's the basis of me saying, well, let's keep moving in this direction. Let's stop hindering adjustment and let's do better RD&E because it works. The worry is the backsliding, as I call it. Every day you'll get calls to return to regulation from farmer groups. Particularly prevalent in Queensland. I noticed the last federal election, Labor offered Queensland a minimum price for milk and the farmers. And then the last state election, I think Deb Pedersen sent me some information saying 30% subsidy on water that's used for horticulture and 15% subsidy on water that's used for sugarcane. Oh, and many operators were both growing sugar and horticulture. And Deb said, well, this is the first time, this is the first. The price of the water depends on what paddock you put it on. So these calls for re-regulation are always present. And I used to think progress was onwards and upwards, education was onwards and upwards. We can easily go back. The 1994, there was a decision made that drought policy was drought should never be a surprise. We'll go to a self-reliant drought policy and we will put more of the planning burden back on the risk takers, the entrepreneur or farmer who knows they're in a risky business and knows the drought will happen. Mid-90s, National Party in power, all that reversed, and we haven't looked back since. We've got concessional credit, we've got subsidies here, we've got subsidies there. These are the sorts of subsidies that are keeping farm. And the National Farmers Federation, to their credit, supported free trade in the mid-80s, supported a sensible drought policy in the mid-90s. In that good farmers with prospects to growth, ambitions to grow, were being hindered by subsidies to poorer farmers that just end up in land values and hindered and slowed down a rate of adjustment that would have been more beneficial. So that's backsliding is always going to be there. Another couple of minutes, we'll go to questions. There's evidence there. Look, they're large. You don't have to be large. Medium, well-run medium farms can get good returns to capital. Large farms can get returns to capital. Some large, if they get too large, they go broke. But if you've got too small, they've got no hope. And it doesn't matter what activity you're in. Milk prices, when we did deregulate in 2000, we charged consumers a 10-cent tax, 11-cent tax for 10 years to do it. But milk prices became one. And adjustment kept occurring. We're down to 4,000 and a bit dairy farmers now. There was 46,000 in 1965 or some such thing. So less farmers, more output, more efficient. There's a productivity change for you. Same with grains. About a large proportion of the grains industry don't earn much of a return on capital. 70% can earn 5% and above. That's 10-year average over 2009 to 2019. Different farmers each year, but a proportion of the industry have got scope to make good returns on capital, and a significant proportion haven't got much scope. Mike Stevens' PhD on intergenerational transfer has shown that about half the broadacre farms he looked at had less than 250,000 gross income. Well, that's not a business that's going to be able to grow. It's going to be able to be passed on to the next generation and provide retirement for the owners and look after the other siblings in the family. So there's plenty of scope, is what I'm arguing for, adjustment. And there you go. Bigger farm size, less farmers has been happening for a long time and needs to happen more, is the argument. Fine, let me wrap up. Just to come back to this diagram, because this is the key. With given technology, when we think about ag R&D increasing, when we think about productivity, we automatically think of ag R&D giving us new technology. That's fine, but at the same time, ag R&D can give us better use of existing technology by looking at the whole system. And policy can give us better use of existing technology within this technical frontier by not hindering adjustment, but facilitating it. I won't go into what's not helpful, but there's widespread economic literacy and there's a litany of fallacies, footprints here and footprints there. Everyone knows that as my sermon. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening. Every day I see new research outputs, I see exciting research happening. And the thing that strikes me is I work with farmers, their businesses are going 100 mile an hour. And then you look at the industry productivity stuff and you say, oh, it's all gloom and doom. A real disconnect. And I won't go through the technologies that are available, but it's terribly exciting. There's the sort of conclusion, link better the abstract and the real. use profit, wealth and liquidity as farm performance criteria, recognise the role of good science, reassert RD&E as market failure and apply role of government criteria, return rigour in evaluating RD&E investment decisions, resist the backsliding that I've mentioned. I wanted to finish with this. Tony Fisher and John Passura, both graduates of Melbourne in the 60s, still at it. And I think that's an inspirational photo, and I loved it, so I had to show that. But equally important, a new paper just out, Making Science More Effective, by a host of fantastic scientists the ones I know there, Julian Olson, economist, David Connor, a colleague from School of Ag, Tony Fisher, School of Ag, Richard Gray, fantastic economist, Peter Heyman, terrific ag economist, John Kierkegaard, some great scientists there, John Passura, Tony Fisher, and Tim Reeves. They've made some really good points, many of which intersected with my own thinking, and that's in Advanced Agronomy, it's just out. But they make those points about the connection between the science and the farm and all that stuff. And as I said, some of the GRDC, I think, does that really well. That's a paper worth chasing up. On that note, let's just have a good look at that photo and be inspired, because I am. Thank you. John, Mark, we might have some questions.
Bill, thank you very much. Just trying to get my video back on. Yeah, there we go. Actually, we do have quite a few questions, Bill. Can I just remind everybody that the questions should go in the Q&A, please, and not the chat? But I see we've got quite a lot. I had some questions, but I won't start because we've got so many questions in the Q&A. Let's see if we can activate people's microphones to ask the questions. And I'll start with Peter Small. Peter, do you want to ask your question? You've got two. You might want to ask them both. Peter, can you hear me? Can you unmute your microphone? Otherwise, I'll just ask them.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Congratulations, Bill, on a very good lecture, and thank you. But I was going to ask my old perennial, if I may, and that is, how do you motivate low productivity farmers? Or in other words, how do you put lazy assets to work?
Well, it's not compulsory to farm well, Peter. And it depends whose farm it is and what their motivations are. Like, some farmers already know how to farm better than they do, we know that. But I know what you're talking about. When we drive around, we see paddocks full of onion weed and bent grass and think, why isn't the farm better? And we know if you bought it, that paddock would be fired up carrying 20 DSE. The technology's there. It comes back to goals and risk in one way. Comes back to ability to finance the investments. If they're a bit of a catch-22, they're farming badly, they've got no borrowing ability, or they haven't got the managerial skills, so they're not going to be able to borrow to do the things that lift the productivity. We certainly know how to do it, because you just got to look next door. Tom Jackson did his PhD with me on pasture improvement in the Western District, and he found that basically took 3 years to make the decision about adopting a new species, and their probabilities of success changed. The main thing was getting a trial on your own property, though. District trials helped a bit, but not much. If it grew on my farm as a trial, I'll grow more of it. So, but as we know, some farmers spend too little time learning, and some spend too much time learning. Too much time learning. I used to be unsure, in doubt, but now I'm not so sure. And too little time learning. People just know they're often wrong, but never in doubt. But what are the barriers to people doing things? How do you get them to do more? I'd say stop making it easy to farm badly by removing the subsidy so that you can buy their paddock better and put it in the hands of people who can.
Peter, do you want to ask your second question? And perhaps if you do, maybe give us an example of what you mean. Peter, you're still there? Okay, maybe not. Let's move on then. Lucinda Hogan, you had a question for Bill. Lucinda.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Bill. How you going? You mentioned the shift we're seeing to a lot more private investment in RD&E, and particularly into ag startups with a lot of venture capital money going in there. And in some cases, I would say the investments are actually in things that are market failure and should be done with public money rather than private money. So what do you see as the benefits or risks associated with this shift in investment that we're seeing?
Well, nothing. Well, private investment, I would have thought is attacking problems where they can capture the benefits themselves. So that's the public investment has to happen where there is market failure, which is the benefits can't be captured by the private sector. And in many ways, they're tackling different problems, or they would be, I would have thought. So I don't think it's a problem of private sector investment. I'd say it's a problem of a lack of public sector investment where there is genuine market failure, because the private sector won't be tackling those problems, and it's a genuine role of government that's not being met. In terms of private sector and with patents, and if they can capture the benefit, that's a good thing too. So I think I'd turn your question around. I'd say the risk is the decline in public sector investment that is not attacking the public good type market failures.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Joseph Markham, you have a question. I don't know whether this is a relation given the surname name, but or not. Joseph, did you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can, yeah.
Yes, I am Bill Malcolm's son, and I did get a lot out of the presentation and all the insights. I was just alarmed or sort of very excited by the prospect of 10 to 20% return on invested capital that's available for these RD&E projects. And I was wondering how there's such a shortfall if you have such large prospective returns, especially in very low interest rate environments. Why isn't government jumping all over strong, robust, cost benefit, positive projects and getting money into these very, very lucrative projects? And then I sort of the answer seemed to be maybe that the noisy, sort of low productivity, lazy farmers, as Peter Small sort of coined it, are being too noisy and being listened to by government too much. Is that a part of the story, or is there a broader picture?
Yeah, good question. Boy, you've been keeping bad company all your life, I'd say. But this is the question serious ag economists like Julian Alston and Phil Pardey have written a lot about, and it's worldwide, this decline in part of my answer is just with federal and state government budgets being tightly constrained, and they will be severely constrained the next 10 years. That's why there's an urgency in my talk today, because I can see the problem that Phil and Julian have identified, this declining public investment, despite it being a good investment. I can see that getting far, far worse in the next decade because of the constrained budgets. One is constrained budgets. Two is just people don't know, like agriculture doesn't exist in the general public or the general economy as an ignorance thing. It's a bit like Dr. Johnson when did his dictionary, and he defined a horse's pastern as a horse's knee. And a woman challenged him and said, "How did that happen?" And he said, "Ignorance, madam, pure ignorance." And so I think that's part of the answer.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I've got one here from an anonymous attendee, but I think it's a good question, so I'll read it out. With yields potentially topping out on average around Australia, should the farming industry focus on research in marketing and risk management to provide better returns?
Risk management is a huge part of the farm system in surviving and succeeding and growing and achieving your goals. And that's just non-negotiable. You've got to be good at it, otherwise you're out of business. It's not related to the level of yield so much, but it's just part of the goal. The part of the game is as you intensify, you actually increase the volatility and the mean average income. So, and it's going to get rougher, it's going to get more volatile in the future for various reasons. but simply increasing productivity will increase the variance around the mean. So risk management is certainly a huge part, and to their credit, some of the RDCs have got it, and I know that GRDC again does. They've got risk management right up there, along with the traditional technical yield. Marketing is a bit of a fallacy. We're a small exporter. People put up these ideas that we should promote our product and we'll be able to sell more. No, we can't. It's not differentiated. We're a small player, and if we do achieve in shifting the demand curve somewhere, we're shifting it for everybody in the market. So big fallacies. The dairy industry, Dairy Australia has really made some big mistakes there on thinking that marketing was the answer. It's not. Same for the wheat industry or any of our industries. The answer is mostly within the farm gate and efficiency in the value chain. I haven't talked about value chain today, but R&D within the value chain too is legit and has good returns. Marketing is the last thing I'd be spending a cent on.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you, Bill. Jim Moll, would you like to ask your question and open your microphone? Jim Moll? Okay. Jim, are you there?
I think I'm. Yep.
Yep, you're on. Yep. Yep.
Yep. G'day, Bill. Jim Moll here. How you going? Just a question surrounding drought. I like your graph where you pulled out the effects of drought and looked at the rate of ag productivity without that. But just going back to that graph, like everyone tells us with the change in climate that we're seeing, there's going to be more regular droughts in the future. How do you think ag in Australia is placed to cope with that more regularity in dry seasons? Are we on the right track, or what are we doing wrong?
Some are, Jim. I think as a general thing, I'd be running a higher equity. I'd be looking at a bit of spatial diversification if it suited my industry. I'd be looking at portfolio diversification. I'd be getting some of the assets out of drought-affected sectors or out of agriculture into other things. Like all the old risk management rules still apply, but probably in spades because it is. But the good farmers are very good at. They know that only 2 or 3 years in 10 they're going to make a lot of money. Other years they'll hang on, and a couple of years they'll lose a bit of money, and that's just going to be more, right? It's going to be the same but more. I think more difficult, and I think you'd probably want to be running. Whereas good entrepreneurial farmers were happy to run 75, 80% equity and build it up and run it down, build it up, run it down. You might want to have a bit more equity, a bit more diversification in maybe activities. You might run more sheep instead of crop a lot. You'll have a bit more diversification in your whole asset portfolio. And if it suited you, you'd have a mix of country. Like I've been interested in a few farms lately who've bought dairy farms in southwest Victoria, as it's going to be going to grow more grass there probably as it warms up a bit. So yeah, diversification I think is one of the, in many ways, would be one part of my answer. And I'm just confident that at least the farmers I know are so bloody smart and switched on and going for it that they're all over this stuff. By the time I get to talk to them about it, they've done it,
Thanks, Bill. Next question comes from Mike Stevens. I'll just read it out because we're running out of time, and I'll read out a few. Mike Stevens says, assuming we retain the levies and the research and development organisations, how can we justify having separate research bodies for broadacre industries?
Yeah, that's a perennial, Mike. It comes up in all those reviews, and also what falls through the cracks, The cropping industries are interested in pastures, and now pasture industries are interested in cropping. I think there's always a suggestion to have less RDCs or to have a cross-sectoral RDC, which we had and we got rid of. Those questions are going to become more and more prevalent, I reckon. So the RD system and the levy system, it's not, it's not going to stay as it is. It's going to change, and that all that work that falls between the cracks by having a sheep RDC or a meat RDC and a dairy RDC and a grains RDC, and we're all using pastures, it just keeps coming up, Mike. So I think maybe, I don't know the chances of us getting a solution, but it's not really satisfactory, I don't think, the way it is.
Bill, we've got quite a lot of questions, and I think we're pretty much out of time. But I'll finish on this one from Robert Banks, because it's one that we can all go and spend our money on, I think, if you answer it right. So he asks, do you have any thoughts on how agricultural industries should be pricing emissions, and what sort of punt on the future should be made?
Very good, Rob. And just by the way, John, if you send me all those questions, if I can reply to the people by email. Yeah, it's warming. We're doing it. We know the solution, and it's a price on carbon. If you've got a price on carbon emissions, we'll get the right amount of carbon emissions. We're not headed in that direction, but the science is headed in that direction. I hear these stories about, we can reduce cattle carbon emissions a lot through what we feed them, but also through our systems, through our mature cow size, whole system approaches. We can actually, a little bit of thought. There's also a lot of exaggeration about soil carbon, by the way. That's not going to be the answer by any means, because if you grow dry matter, we're going to consume it. It becomes an emission. A bit happens under the ground with the soil roots, but don't think it's soil carbon's the answer. But I think whole system is the answer. And if we can get a price on carbon emissions, like if I was farming, I'd be buying, if there was a price on carbon emissions and they could sort of allocate that emission to my farm, I'd be farming 100 mile an hour, whatever was best, and buying cheap emissions from a third world country a small farmer might be growing trees that are productive and also storing carbon. International trade and a price, there's your answer. And farm as best you can, do what makes sense, and reduce the emissions in the cheapest way possible, which may be doing things on the farm, be some of that, be buying them elsewhere from people who can do it more cheaply.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, I am going to end this now, although you do have a lot of questions still, and hopefully we will be able to keep those questions. An alternative is you could stay on the session, I think, if you wanted, and just answer the questions with those that have asked the questions.
Happy to do that.
But I will have to leave and go to another meeting. So, I mean, what I suggest is those that would like to stay on and have a chat, they can do so, I think, using the system, and the rest of us will leave. But Bill, I wanted to thank you very much for that. You've obviously got a lot of interest in what you've said from a lot of people here, and I think your insights are very valuable to all of us, given your huge experience in this area. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, John. And in normal circumstances, we'd all go to the pub now and we could answer those questions properly.
Exactly. So the alternative to going to the pub is anybody that wants to stay online with Bill can do so. I hope my leaving doesn't just cause the whole thing to close. But anyway, Bill, you should be able to have all the online questions.
Right.
Okay. We'll see what happens when I leave. I think it should be fine. Mark Potter's on the line still. Okay, bye.
Okay. Now, Mark, I see John Freeman's got a point there, which it's just the adverse effects of climate change has really built productivity.
Yeah. So Bill, Robert Banks. Robert seems to have gone. I'm just going to go down the list of speakers and see who's still actually. A lot of people have already left.
Yeah, had enough. I don't blame them.
Shane is gone. I don't know if Mike might still be around. Mike's got another question. You there, Mike?
Yes, thank you. Bill, what's the research and development needs extension before it'll be adopted? What do you think the danger is of state governments re-entering this space?
The two broke, Mike, you're safe. See, in the 50s and 60s, state governments seem to have better funds or more funds to allocate to agriculture and to extension, and people in it who extension people who really were well-trained ag scientists. That has dropped away a fair bit. There's still a bit of extension, state extension, but the way I see state governments, departments getting, struggling more and more, and I just think the next decade, the budgets are going to be such a mess. I wouldn't have thought there's any chance, to be honest. If I could bet on it, I almost would, that they wouldn't be expanding extension.
Yes, but it's the word chance worries me. The danger is a better word.
Yeah, I get that.
Okay, so Nicole has gone. Bob Redden has left us. Sorry, people, I just have to go through and see who is still actually online. Jim Mole's got another question. Jim, if you could unmute.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Look, it's just another quick one. Doing a bit of work with dairy farmers in the Goulburn Valley, Bill, and what do the state rate of structural adjustment's been pretty huge in the last couple of years out there. However, there's still a lot of small dairy farms who are still surprisingly profitable and able to hang in there. What are your views in terms of not particularly Goulburn Valley, but the scale of dairy? Does it, how can it get bigger or remain profitable in the medium term?
Yeah, there's a lot in that, Jim. I should get David Becker to answer, but I used to judge a competition for David Becker, and there was a farmer in the Kiewa Valley. He had 120 cows, and every year he got 13-14% return on capital. He won it every year, but as a living and a cash flow, there was 120 cows. There's no cash in it, so there's no prospects for growth, etc., etc. But it was fine. He was fulfilling his goals. But there was no, so it was an efficient use and return on capital, but there just wasn't big enough to generate a bloody living, and one of the partner had to work or something elsewhere. So there's all those arrangements, and that's fine. If it's getting good return on capital in economics, it's an efficient use of the resources. And dairying is not a thing where big it doesn't lend itself to big is better like cropping does. And certainly you see, 400, 500, 600 cow operations extremely efficient. Double that and the complexity, you mean they're extremely inefficient. So where the only way the rate of adjustment is too slow is if people are using resources inefficiently and being helped to do it by the public, because it's a free country, you don't have to farm well. But if the public is subsidising them through drought and all sorts of things to use resources inefficiently, that's disadvantaging the neighbouring farmer, and each of those small farmers, depending on whether they want to pass it on or what their retirement plans and whatever, if they want to grow it and pass it on, they will need to build equity, to build wealth. They need borrowing capacity, and so you do need to grow your business. It's almost unavoidable up to a point, up to a medium size. So the only way adjustment is too slow is if it's actually, if we're sort of hindering adjustment with our policies, really.
Okay, so I Ching Oi has a question for you, Bill. I Ching, you there?
Yeah, I am here. Hi, Bill. Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I guess two things. When we talk about lazy, noisy farmers, I guess when I worked as an extension officer for the state government, I met a lot of farmers who perhaps we wanted them to make some improvements. They could easily make improvements, but they had fairly high equity in their farm, and when you talk to them, they're quite honestly happy with their lifestyle. I met one farmer who milks once a day, and she loves spending time with the kids, and it makes it harder to try and push productivity gains onto those people who are really happy. But at the same time, they do pay the levy, and they question what kind of benefit they get from it. So my question, which I'm getting to in a really roundabout way, is that all farmers pay a levy, but some pay more than others. So should RDCs be focusing on research assisting the top 20% of farmers, or should they be aiming at the low-hanging fruit at the bottom end where known best practices are yet to be adopted, knowing that budgets are getting increasingly tighter?
Yeah, that's a bit of there's this shelf there that farmers are too stupid to get all this research off. And the fallacy of the foolish farmer, which I don't subscribe to really. It depends on goals, as I said before, some people already know how to farm better than they do, but at a stage of life, they want to go to the footy and play bowls. Going back to your criteria of investments in research should be made where the biggest returns are, is the way I see it. And depending if it's in cropping, the new technologies may well favour larger operations. But again, before the investment, we just look at what's the return on capital expected if we invest in this or that, and we just choose the best one. Now, remember, the returns from that investment have an assumed adoption rate, and there's a net gain per adopter. Now, that may well tilt it all towards the big farmers who are already using all the current technologies anyway. But I've never sort of subscribed to the idea that, like, farmers aren't adopting a technology because they're too stupid or lazy. I never ever thought that. I think that's a fallacy. I think they know their systems better than anyone. It comes back to what are their objectives and goals, and why am I farming like I do? Like, different people have different management skills, and my management skills might mean I can only run 7 or 8 DSE to the hectare, whereas Peter can run 20, if you get me. So I don't see low-hanging fruit. I don't see this shelf of unadopted innovations there. I just see making good research investments, and that will be where the adoption and the increase in gross value production that results is the biggest, which almost may well be with those farms that are already performing really well.
Thanks, Yichang, and thanks, Bill. So I think Julian Alston is still with us. Julian, you online?
Yeah, hi. G'day, Bill.
Julian, if I knew you were listening, I wouldn't have been so polite.
That's why I was incognito. Yeah. Thanks for all that. I guess I want to make kind of a comment and ask a question. Many of the things you said were very interesting and on the money, I thought. And one thing, I've just written a paper called Woke Farm and Food Policies in the Post-Truth Era, Calamitous Consequences for the People and the Planet. And the story in that paper is that, we've got lots and lots of scientific potential and lots of wonderful things happening with genetics and digital technologies, but we've got really serious organised opposition. So we're having technologies being regulated out of practice and scientific resources being diverted away from productivity-enhancing research. So I wonder what you think about all that, and what you think the long-term normal productivity growth might be for Australia or for the world, given all of that going on. I know you didn't want to talk about negative things, but that's, I think, the main topic right now.
Well, all you can say about the future is we really don't know, but we can make some guesses. But I would have thought, bloody hell, my own guess is state and federal budgets all over the world is going to be in severely bad shape for a decade. And so I can't see how that's going to help the trend that you and Phil have identified all over the world of declining public investment in ag RD&E. It can only make it worse. And will that be picked up by the private sector? Only to an extent, So I'm never a negative person, but if you want to be rational and hard-headed, it's a pretty grim outlook to me, Julia.
Okay, I think we've got just a couple to go, Bill, for the people who've stuck in here. So Andrew Whitelaw. Andrew, you there?
All right, Bill. How's it going?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for your graph, mate.
That's all right. That's all right. I guess I'll talk about, like the last question was quite a good segue, actually. In terms of research and extension, you mentioned about the private sector picking up versus the public sector. But I guess my experience has probably come more from the private sector than the public sector. And I guess, does research and extension go faster in the hands of private-backed research versus the public system? And I guess on your point there as well about well, they do the research, but is the research more targeted with the main onus being, I guess, profit, but profit back to them rather than the overall industry?
Yeah, like all things, Andrew, it depends. But if you look at genetic modification, like we're looking at 13 years in the private hands, 13 years, like 100 million or some such number to come up with a new, genetically modified drought-resistant wheat or something. So, and that's partly a product of very careful regulation and all that sort of thing. So the private sector still has to work within public sector rules for good reason. So I couldn't we really need to talk to someone who's closely involved in R&D, I guess. Whether and again, it depends on the nature of the research. Like the GRDC have funded a 20-year rotation trial that Roger Armstrong ran at Longronon. Would the private sector have done that? No. So I don't know whether faster is the right question, because it depends on what horses for courses in a way. Each will do what's most beneficial, you'd hope. But as I say, the private sector, which might be going 100 mile an hour in GM, faster than what? It's still quite slow. So much so that they've sort of changed their methods so that we can do it quicker without calling it GM and all that sort of thing. And again, it comes back to incentive, though. You think about the private sector's research into this pandemic vaccine. If you throw enough resources if the problem's big enough for you to throw enough resources at it, it happens pretty quick, doesn't it? Surprisingly quick to the people in the know, like scientists saying things that would have taken 5 years have taken 18 months, sort of thing. So I'm not sure I can give you a much better answer than that, Andrew.
Okay, Bill, last one from Rick Llewellyn. Rick.
Well, last one. Are we deep into time on here, Bill?
Hey, Rick. How are you, mate?
I was interested in your comments about the yield gap, something I have to deal with quite a bit. So you mentioned how the yield gap concept commonly misused, but it's obviously got appeal to especially agronomists and perhaps not economists.
Naive appeal, Rick. Naive. Exactly. You should talk to Tony and David Connor. They know all about this stuff.
I certainly do, but without throwing it out as a concept, because it does have appeal. What's your advice on how to better inject some sound economics into how it's referred to and perhaps applied?
Yeah. I get so frustrated at the naive use of it. And I think it's just that better connection that John Paciora talks about between, lab and the farm. But the advice that I give is sort of the law of the minimum going to constrain what you can do technically anyway. And then the main point I make is we make a cropping decision, as you know as well as me. We put the crop in, we choose our input mix, then we wait and see what happens. And so there's an enormous amount of random luck. A paddock might get rain or it might not. So, and I noticed Tony in that latest paper talks about luck. And first time I've seen the word luck in a good science paper. And to me, that's a step forward, because you don't like to say there's a lot of luck involved in getting a good crop. and Tony used the phrase yield is complex, which I'm going to start using. I like that one. But I've tended to say the profit maximising yield is going to be different anyway, even to the extent we've got control over things. And then there's a large amount of things we've got no control over. So this conceptual frontier is just a conceptual, not even a potential, because it's not reachable, but it's just a very abstract notion. And the real world is very messy. And I probably can't give you much better answer than that, Rick.
So, Bill, Sam Henty snuck in another question, so that we'll definitely make this the last one, participants. So, Sam.
Yeah, g'day, Bill. Currently, I hear a lot about building resilient farmers within the walls of AgVic, and one of the tools that has been suggested is multi-peril insurance. Do you think that multi-peril insurance could, as you put it, impede structural adjustment?
If it's subsidised, and if people use it, Ian McClellan said once at a meeting, this was a couple of years ago, so you're saying they're trying to flog multi-peril insurance. He said, so if I can afford it, I don't need it. And if I need it, I can't afford it. We will get insurance products, don't worry, but all over the world, all the multi-peril crop insurance has had to have at least 50% public subsidy, right? Now, I'm sure we'll get good products with better technologies, and we've still got the moral hazard problems and adverse selection problems of insurance, and I don't know how we get around those, but with technology we should be able to measure things better, and there should be insurance products out there. But I just said it's just another thing I could think about doing to manage the risks I face. And I always talk about you do many things to manage the risk, and you might use price risk management, you might not, you might do other things, So that's just one other option. And if I need it, if I've got a lot of debt, all that. But I don't think the products are there, and I don't think they're getting used yet to the extent they're getting used much. And so I'd be saying, well, make sure you get everything else right, farm well, not to have too much debt, and all those other things I talked about. If you want to stay in business, that's how I interpret resilience, as sort of surviving in business and being happy. But I'd be optimistic about the prospect of insurance products with new technologies enabling us to accurately and measure things and reduce some of the scope for corruption or whatever. But at the moment, as Ian says, he regarded in his system then that, well, a lot of other things I'll be worried about before I need to worry about multi-peril insurance, because I'll manage my risks in other ways, such as, and I think his answer was run a few more sheep, which wasn't bad.
Okay, we might draw it to a close there. Thanks to all the participants and all the people who have asked questions. Bill, fantastic talk. I think you might have set a record for participants for the Dean's Research Seminars, which is great. Thanks to everybody, and especially thanks to Bill. And I think if there's still 35 people online, if you want to ask Bill more questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them via email or give him a call. He probably knows most of you anyway. So thanks for that, Bill.
All right, mate.
Have a good day, everybody.